this is Local Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance in Sacramento, and she is back. She is Judy Lin. She is a reporter with CalMatters. You can find her work and some enterprising work that you've never seen until this organization hit the scene at calmatters.org. I love your work, you know that, and I've been covering education and education reform ever since I've been covering Sacramento, and you made me think about education in a way that I hadn't, and I just thank you for that.
Thank you.
And so let's talk about your recent articles about education reform, and let's kind of go back to 2010. What was the overall view of school districts, local school districts?
Yeah. So for a long time, California has taken a very centralized approach to how we govern schools, managing school performance. This is very much from the No Child Left Behind era, the idea of accountability and making sure schools were meeting test score benchmarks. Then Jerry Brown came along.
Yes, he did. He came back.
He came back,
right.
Yeah.
And he provided we could call it a new formula, really a revolution in terms of education reform, education policy through the adoption of what is known as a local control funding formula, and talk to us about how that formula really changed the dynamic, the relationship between Sacramento and local districts.
Mm-hmm. So keep in mind, Jerry Brown had started 2 charter schools in Oakland. He has seen how hard it is to move the needle on student performance. He brings with him decades, going back to the 50s, years of seeing education fads and trends and what works and what doesn't. So with that, he and his chief education advisor, State Board of Education President Michael Kirst.
Right, formerly of Stanford University.
Yes, yeah. He still works out of
he
there.
does, okay.
He does, yeah. And they devised this formula for directing more money to low-income students, English learners, foster children. And this is the idea to give more resources to the needy. And because a lot of school districts are, funded by their local property taxes, and there's a lot of need in the poor pockets.
And we essentially eliminated those categoricals, the programs that demanded you spend X dollars on this and Y dollars on this. They were all but eliminated, and now local districts can spend money as they choose. But what you have then is really the power devolving to those local districts in a way that we haven't seen probably since Brown versus Board of Education. I mean, this is a real shift. And in that shift, and what really you did is made me think about the question of accountability. How do you have accountability, and I don't mean that as a 4-letter word, in an era of decentralization?
Yeah. And Jerry Brown and his philosophy is you don't.
You don't.
You don't. And that's mind-boggling.
And it is, and I never thought of it. I always was focused on LCFF and more power to the districts, but that next step is you can't have traditional accountability, because as part of LCFF and this education reform, you have the State Board of Education being less interested in uniform accountability standards. I mean, we have seen discussions, what is it called, a multiple measure school accountability system that may or may not be adopted. But again, as I understand it, the State Board is saying, you adopt your own measurements.
Yeah, so you have a new NCLB. It's called the Every Student Succeeds Act.
That's federal.
Yeah, so the feds are coming in saying, here, at minimum, you need to check for the bottom 5% of performing schools every 3 years. We need to be supportive. The state should have a plan for helping these schools. But the board right now is in development of a new rating system. And it's going to be used by parents and the public for years to come. And this is why you have this tension between local control and what is being mandated, what the state is demanding. And civil rights groups are pushing the state to make sure you have some apples to apples comparisons of schools so that you can, if not index the schools and rank them, at least be able to know here's where they stand on absenteeism, suspension,
Well, that's
school climate.
what you discuss in the articles. Yeah, the school climate, that general, it's non-academic measurements. It's how is the student feeling. It's that notion of emotional well-being, resilience, grit. It's kind of the term du jour. And I remember I mentioned to you a few years ago, I wrote an article for my daughter's school publication, and we talked about this concept of grit, and it was coined by a professor from the University of Pennsylvania, Angela Duckworth. I learned her name a few years ago, and she actually is a little queasy about this notion of assessing grit, resilience, because how do you assess it? Through self-assessment?
Yeah, and this is what's interesting now. We're seeing 6 urban school districts, including San Francisco and Los Angeles, testing it out and actually taking these subjective surveys and incorporating it into their school rating. And Angela Duckworth was concerned that, in her mind, all measures are flawed, and so
by definition,
and so this is an interesting undercurrent that's happening at these urban school districts.
And at the same time, this plays into the concerns that have been expressed by teachers and teachers' unions. They've been very nervous about these objective measurements, and in an era of decentralization, they presumably can exert more power over the local school boards. That's what you indicate in your articles. And as well, when you look at these school climate surveys, they presumably could get more involved in the fashioning of them?
Yeah. Well, they're treading lightly on this issue. It's delicate because they're asking voters this November for a tax extension.
On Prop 30 for the wealthiest.
Yes. They're asking, there's a school bond question before voters.
$9 billion.
Yes. So there is an ask before the public right now. And they also don't want to cross civil rights groups and activists. They are mindful that a big chunk of California's school population is Black and brown.
Right.
And so,
I think it's 60%. I think that's what you indicated.
Yeah.
60% of public school kids are of color.
Yeah.
But what can be so frustrating for parents today is my kid is in school today. He's not or she's not in school in 5 years. So all these plans that will take 5 years to roll out, that doesn't help the kids today. So the kids today are literally in the midst of just a huge sea change. You have Common Core, you have LCFF, you have LCAP. I mean, it's a little unnerving. Is that fair?
Yeah. This is what it's. I wrote it's an experiment of California proportions.
Right, literally, and it was very well stated. But do you believe that California parents should be concerned about this grand experiment? Because again, our kids are in school today. We don't have the luxury of freezing them in time, and they're part of this grand experiment.
Yeah, and if your child is graduating high school, it may not happen. But
fine.
if you're in elementary school, you will see this. You will be impacted. This new rating system will be adopted in the next school year, and then in the next school cycle. You have new science standards coming in the pipeline. You have all these decisions being made now, and they'll be impacting students as they move along. And so we're talking about more than 6 million students, and it's the nation's largest public school system.
Truly. Okay, you really should take the time to read these articles. They're very compelling. They are insightful. They really dig into the nitty-gritty. Her name is Judy Lin. She is a reporter with CalMatters. Of course, you can find that website at calmatters.org. I signed up for the automatic email list because I like to get the articles once they hit. My name is Brad Pomerance. We're in Sacramento today, and this is Local Edition.